Hello everybody, and welcome back to another video. Today we'll be taking a look at one of the kings of budget GPUs, the GTX 1050 Ti. For years, this card would regularly place within the top 4 GPU spots on the Steam hardware survey up until around 2023. Even today, there's still a solid 1.4% of users using this card. But what has kept it in the running for so long? Let's take a look at the specs and find out, shall we? Releasing back in 2016, this card retailed for around $140 or $188 accounted for today's inflation. That alone should tell you why this card was so popular for the time. The only recent cards you could even find today for that price would be an Intel Arc. Running on the 14nm Pascal architecture, this card is clocked at 1291 MHz, which can boost up to 1392. Its 4GB of GDDR5 memory is running at 1752 MHz, all on a 128-bit memory bus. Running on PCIe 3x16, it also receives all its power from that slot as well, not requiring any 6-pin for its 75W TDP, making it perfect for those low-powered systems. For its rendering capabilities, while DirectX is a version behind, Vulkan and OpenGL are fully up to date, so we won't have too much trouble being able to boot up modern games. Video outs are also not particularly impressive, just one DVI, one HDMI 2, and one DisplayPort 1.4a. You won't be running quad monitors, but you can still get some high resolution output though. Nvidia just recently dropped support for the 10 series GPUs, relegating them to security updates last year. That's still really recent compared to a lot of the GPUs we've tested on this channel, but it's still something to keep in mind. But driver support can only get a card so far for its performance, which we'll just have to check out in the benchmarks. With our standard Ryzen 5600 test bench, let's see what this 2016 Budget King can really do. With our synthetic benchmarks, we can get some relative insight into the 1050 Ti's gaming prowess. And with 7638 for FireMark and 2584 for TimeSpy, this is one of the better cards we've looked at, but still lagging well behind the RX 570 and the GTX 970 we reviewed prior. It looks like today's GPU is going to handle itself decently well at 1080p, but 1440p is going to be relegated to those lightweight games and indie titles. Starting off our benchmarks with a game that would have been relevant around the time, Watch Dogs ran perfectly fine here, running at a 1080p medium preset. We got ourselves 80 FPS average with 62 and 58 for the lows. Considering the game acts a little wonky above a 60 FPS cap, there's definitely some wiggle room to push things into higher settings. You might say that the game was 2 years old at this point, of course it ran great, which is fair. But considering that these were the years where 768p was still a prominent resolution to play at least by Steam hardware survey standards, I think it's pretty cool that such a cheap entry-level card was pushing these kinds of frames at 1080p at a decent preset. Onto the more modern stuff, Helldivers is doable but will require a bit of visual sacrifice to achieve. Using the Steam Deck preset and setting our render scale to performance, the game looks pretty pixelated. Nothing showing that more than the blocky special effects, just look at that rain. But what remains is a decently smooth experience. 72 FPS for our average with 50 and 42 for the lows, it's playable, but I would say it's far from ideal, especially when trying to play night missions. While being a modern remake, System Shock is highly stylized and pretty well optimized, meaning we have little trouble running it on our 1050 Ti. At 1080p with a mixture of medium and high settings, we've managed 93 FPS with a solid 60 and 13 for our lows. The game can hitch every now and then, usually relegated to special effects, but having never really dropped down below 60, this still remained relatively stable. Night Dive has done a great job with this remake, lending us an experience that while giving us good frame rates, didn't skimp on the visual department either. If it's some esports gaming you're looking for, then the 1050 Ti can still keep up a decent pace. Running CS2 at 1080p medium preset, we've got a pretty nice 143 FPS average with 94 and 73 for the lows. Smokes can cause massive drops down into the low 80s, but otherwise it was relatively smooth. Counter-Strike 2 has never been that hard of a game to run, but it's nice to know that even when gaming on a budget, you should have little issues missing your deagle headshots. Fortnite is a pretty similar story here, running at 1080p medium-ish settings at performance mode, and with a resolution scale of 85%, we managed a whopping 181 FPS average with 116 and 57 for our lows. I would say that's worth the hit to visual fidelity, because without it, we're definitely struggling here. Turning off performance mode, and even with a quality TSR upscale, we're barely hovering around the 60 FPS mark, although the lows remained pretty stable as well. I also did try DirectX 11 rendering, and while it did give us a slight boost to the average FPS, those percentile lows took a massive hit in comparison, giving an overall worse feeling experience. DX12 performance is definitely the choice to go for here on this little card. Upscaling is the name of the game with Deep Rock Galactic for those wanting high frame rates. As while running at 1080p medium normally played pretty alright, we got a massive leap in performance just turning on ultra quality FSR2. 212 FPS average with 116 and 29 for our lows. It's not much of a surprise considering how well this game ran on a GT 1030 we tested, but we are running on a higher preset here, and that's nothing to sneeze at, even if it is with FSR. While Black Mesa can run on a variety of hardware, attempting to push the settings can lead to some interesting results. Running at a 1080p high preset, we get an acceptable 87 FPS average, and with around 30s for the lows, you'd think it's not too bad of an experience. And it truly isn't that bad until we get into outdoor sections or Zen. FPS can fluctuate wildly, anywhere from the hundreds to the 30s just depending on where you are looking, which absolutely disrupts our frame time pacing. As I said before, Zen is pretty similar in that regard as well, so while for the most part you could get away with a high preset, I recommend swapping down to medium for consistency's sake. For those looking to play some MMOs on the cheap, the 1050 Ti isn't actually doing too bad here. Playing Final Fantasy XIV at 1080p medium settings, with FSR always enabled, we've managed a solid 90 FPS with good lows of 60 and 40. I will say, however, the game did feel kinda sluggish at times. Although I'm not sure if that was because I was playing through a capture card, since the footage looks pretty smooth. But overall, this is a solid experience, especially since a lot of these older cards have been hit pretty hard from Dawntray's graphical update. The Witcher 3 was actually a pretty surprising one, to be honest. Playing on the latest patch with all the next-gen enhancements, we still got a pretty playable frame rate. 1080p low with dynamic res enabled, the 1050 Ti managed a solid 75 FPS average with good lows of 47 and 20. Even at these low settings, the game looked phenomenal, and felt relatively smooth even when we dipped below 60 on the rare occasion. Whether it's with the Enhanced Edition or the Legacy patch, the 1050 Ti is still putting up a fierce fight. Being in early access, Hytale could use a bit more work in the optimization department. But for those gaming on a budget, this game will still run pretty decently. Hitting 99 FPS average with 58 and 52 lows, it wasn't uncommon to see the framerate fluctuate pretty wildly at 1080p medium. Although with it never really dropping below 60, it still remains relatively smooth throughout while building a house and exploring caves. I'll cut it a little slack considering it's a miracle this game released at all, and it was still delivering a pretty good experience. Vintage Story is once again delivering a mighty fine experience for those looking to get their survival game fix. Once again at 1080p medium, we got a whopping 147 FPS average with 65 and 40 for the lows. It's similar to Hytale in that the frame rate fluctuates pretty wildly, but here with all this foliage, it definitely makes a bit more sense here. However, it still never felt sluggish to play, and managed a higher average and 1% low. Although it could be due to the game preferring Nvidia cards, as the RX 570 we tested last video was delivering similar performance despite being the stronger card of the two, which is definitely something to keep in mind. Capping off the benchmarks with something that hasn't even released yet, Pragmata pleasantly surprised me here. Even though we had to drop the graphical settings to low and turned on FSR3 to quality, the game looks a little crunchy, but still alright. And with our average FPS of 35 and lows of 26 and 23, while it's no 60 FPS, it still felt relatively smooth and I had no issues when playing through the demo. The fact we're running a 2026 title with a decently stable frame rate, at 1080p, even if it's with FSR, is pretty admirable considering the recommended minimum requirement asks for a 1660 or 5500 XT, both of which are quite a bit better than this card. In conclusion, it's clear that the Pascal architecture is still holding on strong almost 10 years later. As long as you keep your expectations in check, this can still be a pretty capable 1080p card, even for certain modern day games like Pragmata showed. Although value-wise, it could be pretty hard to justify, as on the secondhand market, you can find it anywhere from about $50 to $70, which, as I said in the last video, is that kind of price range where there's a lot of competition like the GTX 980. If you're able to snatch up the low-profile version of the card, that could be really worth it for those with small cases or office PCs. But either way, this is still a capable card, and a good showing of why Pascal is so highly regarded. I would like to thank you all for watching. Feel free to like and subscribe if you liked the video, don't if you didn't, and I will see you all next time.